This is Roger Hallam, and you're listening to Designing the Revolution. This is Talk 5, Part 2. So what's the plan? Alright, so in the first part of this talk, I went through the general design principles. And in this part, I'm going to go through the talks or explain how I'm going to do the rest of the podcasts in a little bit more detail. So just to see where we're up to, as I think you've hopefully got it in your heads by now, this revolution is coming one way or another. It's not an act of faith, it's not an ideological projection, it's a physical reality. But you're probably thinking, you're probably right to think, well, that's all well and good, but there's no guarantee it's going to have a good outcome. In fact, you'd probably be quite within your rights to say, probably going to end really badly because, let's face it, a lot of revolutions do, and it's not that likely to succeed because, these things generally fail. So I just want to confess at this point that, just for the record, I'm not particularly keen on revolutions either. From an observational point of view, they don't seem to work out. They seem to be extremely unpleasant, let's put it like that, a lot of the time. So I want to be clear that for these podcasts, I'm not saying in a perfect world revolution should be happening or shouldn't. I'm pretty agnostic about it, to be honest. But given it is coming, we need to prepare for it. And that's basically where we're coming from. I definitely have a really clear agenda, and I'm sure you listening to this do as well, in terms of, okay, if it's coming, we've got a responsibility to prepare for it and to try and make it a semi-decent sort of affair. So that leads on to this idea, have we actually got any new ideas here? If you look at the revolutions of the last 200 years, they have a rather depressingly predictable pattern. And it would be a reasonable thing to say, you haven't got any great ideas up our sleeves, it's just going to follow the old pattern. Well, the good news, of course, is that history doesn't totally repeat itself, and new things do happen. And yes, we do have a few new cards in our pack, as it were. So since the Second World War, and definitely since 1989, there's been a lot of research on the way that humans tick, human groups, societies, political science. So we're not where we were 50, 60, 100 years ago. We've got a few new ideas. And I'm just going to briefly go through these just to sort of give you a taste of what might be coming down the line. So if you don't totally get what I'm saying here, then don't worry about it. I'm going to be going through it in loads more detail. But I'm going to throw a few cards on the table, as it were. So the first one is proximity, which is, if we are going to design revolutionary episodes, we need to design them so that all the bits connect together quickly in time and space, so that we can control the process, and the process actually leads to some positive revolutionary output. So we need to look closely at the micro design, which is I'm going to talk more about. Secondly, and relatedly, we need to think about what I'm going to call sociability. Now, we could call it a bunch of other things, but this is probably the central concept of the next 20, 30 podcasts. I mean, there's a bunch of other ideas coming in, but this is definitely a central one. And this is the idea that we want to deconstruct this whole notion of the political as lots of atomized computers, i.e. human brains, making decisions without any heart, without any connection, without any desire for social recognition and such like, which is all nonsense, as we've already discussed. And what we are going to be looking at is the micro design of this sociability, how you bring people together so you create the bedrock, as it were, the soil out of which grows the new social norms, social institutions. In other words, we're definitely looking at some deep transformation of cultural and social ways that society operates. So a third idea is deliberation, which is probably a little bit more familiar, which is this whole notion that views do come together when they're given the time and space to deliberate. Deliberate meaning people say where they're up to, what they think, and then they hear what other people think and feel, and through a process of give and take, as it were, they come to some resolution, not just a technical resolution, but a level of emotional connectivity which builds the social fabric of society. And the fourth one, well, people don't know what it means, but it's a fairly simple idea, and that's sortition. So this is the idea that we remove or design out the corruption of the political sphere by giving power to people on the basis of chance, selected by lot, as it's traditionally called. So instead of the political powers that be being able to influence who's given power, i.e. in a representative democracy, through spending money and pre-selecting candidates and then corrupting people once they're in power, you basically end up with this deeply revolutionary notion of selecting ordinary people, caterers, window cleaners, decorators, whatever, ordinary people through a process of arbitrary selection, as you might say, by chance. So you might be thinking, yeah, well, that's, sounds pretty interesting. But, how does this all fit together? What does it really mean? All good questions, and I will be going into quite a lot of detail about it. But I'm hoping to give you that little flavour that there's a few new things coming down the line, right? And humanity is capable of dreaming up new ways of organising itself and having the imagination that we like to think we have, and we do. So there's a little example here. Before Extinction Rebellion came along, the way social movements were organised, the way political parties were organised, was very much a sort of set deal. You sort of knew how it was, and they had their pros and cons, and obviously a lot more cons than pros. But to show how historical developments work, Extinction Rebellion rebelled not just against the governments on the climate crisis, but also against a certain culture and process that had been followed in social and progressive movements for the previous 30, 50 years. And part of this was learning from the United States, the mechanisms of creating Gandhian civil disobedience, which had some sort of cultural depth. It wasn't just a tactic. It was a way of being without sounding too dramatic about it. It had a certain culture. It had trainings and such like. And secondly, connecting a little bit with this idea of deliberation, it was updating the notion of how people make decisions. And this was drawing, to a certain extent, in my view anyway, from German social philosophy since World War II, people like Habermas and such like, and this notion that it's the process of people coming together politically, both internally in XR and between XR and a political opponent, that determines pro-social outcomes. And there's a whole bunch of ideas around that. So you can see, obviously in an imperfect and contingent sort of way, Extinction Rebellion was developing something new. And without putting too fine a point on it, what we're going to be discussing here is a sort of XR 2.0. I know that's a bit of a horrible phrase, but something along those lines. So, to summarise then, there is help at hand. It's not all doom and gloom. And, so let's move on to look at this in a bit more detail. All right. So, won't be a second.
Oh,
right. No, just on the phone. Okay, so what's the next thing I'm going to talk about is the podcasts. So one of the difficulties about doing a linear progression, as it were, of podcasts is with very complicated social processes that we're going to discuss. There's no obvious linear process. It's like things loop back up on each other and circle back, and they're all intermixed and they all affect each other. So you're going to have to bear with me a little bit, because I'm just going to jump in, do a bunch of podcasts, and if you're thinking, I don't really understand how all this fits together, that's because I can't really do it all at once, and you're just going to have to bear with me. And I remember some famous lecturer who discussed Marx's Capital, and he sort of made the same point that, arguably Capital is this great book that Karl Marx wrote, and no, I haven't read it, but he gave what he said about it was, Marx just starts off, and for the first few chapters, you don't really know how it all fits together because it's so complicated, and it's only once you've got into a few chapters you sort of start getting your head around it. So that's my excuse, as you might say. All right, so let's make another key point, which is it's sort of tempting, and I think an expectation will be that I'm just going to do some standard, revolution promotion bunch of podcasts. I'm going to go through, what the program is, what we want to achieve, then how we're going to achieve it. That's not what I'm going to do. Partially because we've got a few cards in the pack. And the cards in the pack basically are brought together under this notion of micro-design. So we've already talked about this idea of design of the social space, that the key space of agency is not the individual, the isolated individual, nor is it sort of macro-analysis, the process of capitalism at some top level. It's the space where people interact, 10 or 20 people in a room, the small group, and that design has massive implications for the cultural and thus political resilience of the revolutionary project. So a sort of classic example here is a while ago I heard Owen Jones. He's a great guy, very progressive, left-wing, knows what he wants. And he gave this sort of rhetorical spiel saying, we have to go out and talk to people and tell them about socialism. And I think he mentioned Cornwall or something. I need to go to Cornwall and talk to people and mobilise them, which is all well and good, of course, but totally meaningless because, for starters, the fundamental design principle is not that you talk to people, but you enable people to talk, which is quite a different kettle of fish. And having made that sort of structural design point, then how you enable people to speak covers a whole multitude of things, which are massively influential on whether they feel empowered to move into some sort of activism role, let's say. So that's one reason why we're going to start off with a whole bunch of work on the nuts and bolts of small-scale organising. And a sort of related idea about why this is a good idea is, without sounding too sort of patronising, everybody listening to this has to be disciplined in the mundanities of organising ordinary people. We're not engaging here in some top-level castles in the air, day after the revolution, we'll just make everything happen. That's all bollocks, with all due respect. Right? What we need to do is to become disciplined and mature enough and hard-working enough, and I can't stress that word enough, hard-working, in order to profoundly understand, not just superficially, but profoundly understand how people tick in groups and how we can enable people to liberate themselves, as is the, major 2-century project that we're part of. So an example here is the Freedom Summer in the civil rights movement in the United States. So the idea was all these white college kids from the northern states were going to go down, I think about 5,000 of them, to Mississippi, if I remember the state rightly, and enable people to get registered for voting. And when they interviewed people, they said, look, if we just want you to stuff envelopes for 3 months, would you still do it? Which is obviously a catch question, because if you said, no, I want to do frontline glorious stuff, they said, well, obviously this person's, got too much of an ego or whatever, and they wouldn't take them on. And this relates to a sort of broader point about traditionally what work gets done by who in social change and revolutionary change. And it shouldn't come as any surprise, of course, which is that traditionally it's women that do these basic jobs, the pastoral work, the small-scale organising, the stuffing the envelopes, as they used to say. And without that women's work, without the work of the guys in the back room, everything else is just not going to happen. So you've got Martin Luther King going off, doing, undeniably great stuff, but behind him you had all these women in churches doing all the support stuff. So I'm not saying this just, in order to sound politically correct, I'm saying with absolute seriousness that this is what we need to focus on, because if we don't, it just doesn't work. It's as simple as that. So what are we going to be looking at in the first series of podcasts then is a whole bunch of talks centered around the process of mobilizing people, the process of organizing non-violent direct action, forms of peaceful disruption, the framing around that, and the overall organization principles. Okay, so what talks am I looking at here? We're looking at a bunch of podcasts around the issues of how to mobilize people, how to organize non-violent direct action, peaceful disruption, around designing the framing for those activities, the media work, and how to bring all that together in some sort of overall organizational structure that has a particular leadership culture and such like. So this is the first part of this podcast series then, this bunch of talks around these basics of small-scale organising, and I'll split each subject into a discussion around the theory, the principles that we're going to apply, and then the practice, and show how the theory and the practice sort of fuses together. This is not a matter of just trundling in there and making it up as you go along. We're going to have some design principles, and then we're going to look at concrete, practical ways of micro-organising people. So there's nothing sort of abstract here, okay? I'm not going to say that the particular micro-designs I'm going to suggest are the be-all, end-all, but you're going to have a really clear idea. As a joke goes, you're going to know where to put the biscuits on the table with your mobilisation meeting. It's that sort of level of detail. Okay, so how does this translate then into, obviously, the broader project on a micro level of social disruption, social collapse, revolutionary upsurgences, and all the rest of it? So the proposition is going to be that this grounding, this creation of a dynamo, as I'm going to call it, of mobilisation, action and organisation, provides what you might call a non-violent army of agitators. And then that can be applied to 3 different scenarios. The first scenario is what I would call the American civil rights movement model, a linear sequence of civil resistance episodes, non-violence episodes, which results in a series of legislative changes. But as we've been saying from the beginning of these talks, in the present context, in this pre-revolutionary context, what's more likely to happen, or at least what we need to be open towards, is to expect there to be openings where we can proactively design whirlwind events where suddenly, from one week to the next, suddenly thousands of people go into the street because of some major 9/11-esque ecological crisis or social crisis which is inevitably coming along. And thirdly, we need to prepare for the very high likelihood that something will come out of nowhere and the revolutionaries in classic historical style will have no input whatsoever because they were too busy sort of trying to work things out and being in their little sort of herd. But something comes out of nowhere and then, you have to chase the tail of it and try and enculture it and structure it so that it produces a pro-social outcome. So this process of creating mobilisation actions, framing, organisation, gives us openings into those three scenarios. Now, those three scenarios, it might just be one, it might be several of them, but that's the opening, that's the door, the three doors, as it were, that open into this macro world. In other words, the top level design of what the hell is this revolution going to look like, and what are we trying to do, and how are we going to make it work. So the second series of podcasts will talk more in detail about two case studies. One is A22. So this is a network of civil resistance projects on the climate crisis around Western democracies, including some of the biggest climate crisis campaigns, such as Last Generation in Germany, ones in Italy, France, and various other places. And all these projects are broadly based upon the best practice of the last 3 or 4 years, which has been enacted through Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil, which of course on themselves have stood on the shoulders of giants. So it's like a continuing, iterative, dialogical process of working out what works best. So we're going to look at that because that's going to be quite interesting, and also looking at how international cooperation and coordination works. Then we're going to look at the Humanity Project. It's a project that at the time of me speaking to you is only sort of half-formed, but this is the project of transitioning from what you might call a classical non-violence climate crisis sort of project into something that's a lot more holistic, that includes elements of standing in elections, cultural activities, changing the culture, forms of assembly, citizens' assemblies, people's assemblies, and of course civil resistance. And this gives us a more concretized gateway into what the transformation of a political regime actually looks like. So that leads us on to this very messy, interactive process of the actual revolution itself. In other words, this revolutionary episode. And the most important thing here is going to be to understand this is not a black and white situation. It's not clear when a revolution starts, and it's certainly not clear when a revolution ends. In other words, what happens is a melee of different forms of resistance, different forms of parallel institutions, different forms of coalition building, and to be perfectly honest, it's super messy. So I'm going to attempt to sort of just march into that space, give it some structure, at least so we can understand some of the principles and some of the priorities, and of course some of the designs that enable us to transfer what could be total chaos into something that looks excitingly pro-social, democratic, and something we can be proud of. And then lastly, and only lastly, we will look at the programme. By the time we look at the programme and do podcasts on the programme, the revolutionary programme, what should be happening, where, when and how, we'll have done it. It will be like the icing on the cake, as it were, of this whole build-up of looking at the micro processes, and then this whole environment of power, and confrontation through which the program is produced. And the program itself, of course, feeds into that process of consolidating people power. So it's all a big backwards and forwards situation, if the truth be known. Okay, so the last few podcasts will deal with the post-revolutionary situation in general terms. So most of what these podcasts are about is the process up to and including the revolutionary period. But I think it's important to take a little bit of an overview on some of the massive conundrums, political conundrums of the last 200 or 300 years, and arguably the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, because I'm sure, you're sitting there making the very valid observation that the problems of humanity are very deep. It's not just a matter of having a revolution and everything trundles along okay again. There's fundamental problems with the way in which we relate to the material world in order to provide for ourselves, namely economic activity, and more specifically, of course, with this, generic culture of capitalistic extraction and exploitation, which has its roots in broader cultural and social phenomenon that go back thousands of years. Please tell your friends, and dare I say it, if you've got a bit of money spare, you can contribute to my Patreon account, because although I have all my meals made for me in this cell I'm in, I do need to pay the mortgage and all the rest of it. So if you can throw me a bit of cash, that would be great. But equally important is, if you think this is sort of interesting, and dare I say it is, tell those other 3 or 4 people that you know about it, and they can listen to it too. That's it. I'll see you next time.